Luxembourg, just a view of the museum there, sort of aerial view in the landscape. Luxembourg is a country with a population of around 625,000 inhabitants in the land area of just over 2,500 square kilometers. According to the World Population Review, while Luxembourg is one of the least populous countries in Europe, it has the largest population growth rate in Europe of around 2% per year. At the end of 2019, Luxembourg City had a resident population of around 123,000 people, of which roughly 70% are considered foreigners, that is to say, not originally from Luxembourg. And that 70% is made up of 164 different nationalities. In order to appreciate the shift in the population and its makeup since the 1980s, so over the last 40 years, in 1985, the population of the city was less than 80,000 people, of which around 25,000, that is to say 30%, were considered foreigners. Sharing its borders with France, Belgium, and Germany, Luxembourg is also part of what is called La Grande Région, the Great Region. In pre-COVID times, and we hope that this will return post-COVID, some 150,000 people travel from the Grande Région to work in Luxembourg every day. In its history as a territory of the Grand Duché and in its present-day reality, Luxembourg is a place of movement and cross-territorial fluidity. It is therefore not surprising that Luxembourg is home to the European High Court, as well as the European Investment Bank. The first building for the European Parliament is in Luxembourg, which actually sits next to the museum, and the country hosts much of the administrative functionaries for the Parliament, which now sits between Brussels and Strasbourg. Just what I'm showing you there is an aerial view where you have in the foreground the sort of remains of the former fortress, upon the site of which Mudam is built. You then next have Mudam. Immediately behind it to the left is the original European Parliament building. And then behind that you have towers, sort of office towers, and to your left a bronze-looking tower, which is the third stage of the European Court, which in fact extends in those buildings all the way to our left there. Right, sorry, I'll stick there. So I just would like to give you a little bit of prehistory and context for the museum before we launch into the sort of subject at hand. The creation of the museum is part of a very recent history. There had been calls for a Centre for Contemporary Art in Luxembourg already in the 1980s. However, it was not until 1995, when Luxembourg became European Capital of Culture, that the museum project was launched. This coincided with the rule of Grand Duke Jean, who was seen to represent a modern, open Luxembourg in the heart of Europe, the country being in the heart of Europe. Pritzker Prize-winning architect Liu Ming-pei was invited to design a dedicated museum in the first half of the 1990s, having successfully completed his projects for the Louvre in 1989 and the museum extension for the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin in, I'm not sure which year, forgive me, I believe the early 90s. For the future museum in Luxembourg, an advisory committee was formed, headed up by Bernard Cesson, who was then the director of the Musée d'Art Moderne de Saint-Étienne, who was charged with developing the basis for the future collection for the museum, with acquisition supported by Luxembourg's National Cultural Fund. It has the acronym here of FOCUNA. The period of development and completion was drawn out, however, by highly politicized controversies around the choice of architect, the architectural project, its scale, the cost of materials, the historic site, the period of art that should be shown in the new museum, whether it should be modern, the École de Paris, or post-war or contemporary, and fundamentally whether Luxembourg needed such a museum at all. Thanks to the commitment and tenacity of successive ministers of culture and public works, the museum was built and inaugurated only in 2006 as the Musée d'Art Moderne Grand Duc Jean, albeit with a program and vision for the collection that was resolutely contemporary. The 1990s was a decade in which many new museums were built in Europe, as I'm sure most of you who are attending this webinar know. I cite the Guggenheim Bilbao, which opened in 1997 and which is considered emblematic of how culture in the form of a signature architectural project could serve urban regeneration and a diversified economic model, which was heavily reliant on tourism. In contrast, but at the same time, the opening of the Serralves Museum of Contemporary Art in Porto in 1999 is showing you a very incomplete view of the museum. But this project might be considered as a counterexample to the Bilbao effect model. There, with Serralves, rather than being led by regional and governmental authorities, the museum was developed out of a will of the artistic community that began to express itself in the 1960s. In the optimistic elan or energy of post-revolutionary Portugal after the revolution in 1974, the creation of a museum for contemporary art with national and international ambition and designed by a Pritzker Prize-winning Portuguese architect, Álvaro Siza, would become a source of civic pride and a symbol of decentralization and regional autonomy. Back in Luxembourg, Mudam was driven by a convergence of motivations that sit on the spectrum of these two examples I have just given. And notably, among its ambitions and motivations was to project an image of Luxembourg through culture and the ambitions of its cultural institutions. This vision was translated in what would become a master plan for the so-called European Quarter, the site of the first EU, which is the site of the first EU Parliament building. I'll go back to that view. At the site of the first EU Parliament building and the European Court, with the Cultural Quarter comprising the National Library, which was recently inaugurated, I think it was earlier this year, but on a different site, but in the same quarter, in the same neighborhood, the Philharmonic Concert Hall and the Mudam. And here I just want to show you a view of the Philharmonie de Luxembourg, which is our neighbor. So, part two, the stuff of the museum. A collection with its associated activities of conservation, research, and display is a defining feature of the museum. Even the new definition for the museum currently being debated by members of ICOM acknowledges these aspects as universal. As with the history of many of today's most important museums in the world, there was, with Mudam, an aspiration that the donation of a significant existing collection might serve as the basis for what would be the future Mudam collection, an ambition that thus far has not ultimately been realized. An acquisition committee presided over by Bernard Sisson was established in 1996 and sought to put in place the foundations of the new collection, basically beginning from scratch. A seasoned curator and former director of the Musée d'Art Moderne, Centre Pompidou, Caisson was, as I mentioned earlier, at the time director of the Musée d'Art Moderne Saint-Étienne, where he had built up an impressive collection of European and American art from the 1960s and 70s, and indeed working very closely with many of those artists. Cesson and his committee for Mudam sought to define a collecting strategy. Caught between the various positions as to what should be the focus of this new collection in Luxembourg, Cesson prevailed in the view that the development of that collection should look to the present and to the future, that is to say, the 21st century. Minutes of committee meetings tell us, however, that representative works from the 1960s to the 1980s were also to be considered, with the aim of establishing points of reference for the art was to come after. This rationale was driven by pragmatism and the improbability of being able to find nor meet the market prices of outstanding available works from these earlier and formative decades. This did not preclude certain works entering the collection by way of donations. Among the acquisitions made at this time were works by established artists within what we today recognize as a predominantly Western and market-led, Western male, I would suggest, and market-led context, but which was very much of its time, and in which contemporary photography was given a particular attention. I'm just showing you, I would just like to take you through some of the works that were acquired at that time, such as Hector by Julian Schnabel, work by Alfred Erlin, sculpture by Richard Deakin from the 90s, major sculptural piece by Tony Cragg, mature piece from the 90s, work by Franz West from the period. Then we have some women artists, Cindy Sherman, Sophie Calle, fantastic works, A Suite Vénitienne, and an important body of works by the photographers Bernd and Hilla Becher, whose portraits of the deindustrialized landscapes of Europe and the United States included sites, the industrial sites or former industrial sites of Luxembourg. Also at that time, so works very much, a decade earlier, but considered timely, Peter Halley, Nan Golden. And as I mentioned earlier, thanks to donations, this rather important, wonderful work by Blinky Palermo and Untitled, work from 1968, which came into the collection through the donation of the European Investment Bank, and that was supported by the National Cultural Fund. The scientific and artistic program for the museum would not be defined fully until the arrival of the museum's first director, Marie-Claude Boulle, appointed in 2000. Boulle further emphasized the approach of the original pre-museum or préfiguration committee with a focus on commissioning site-specific works for the spaces of the museum, along with a vision for interdisciplinarity that included functional design and fashion. So I'll just show you a few views. El Dorado is just a view in one of the galleries of the inaugural exhibition for the museum in 2006. Hussein Chalayan's Afterwards of 2000, which I only learned this week is actually the most requested work from the Mudam collection, and which we will be showing for the first time in 2021 as part of a new display looking at our collection of works related to fashion. Wim Delvoye's Chapel, which was commissioned for a space in the museum. This beautiful work by Nari Ward, which was acquired in 2003 and featured in the El Dorado inaugural exhibition of the collection. Saiko Chang and Grayson Perry. So you can see acquired very, very early on, very much at, with the arrival of Marie-Claude Boulle. Marie-Claude Boulle brought together a new scientific committee in 2000, composed in its first iteration of Carmen Jimenez, Nicholas Sirota, Stefan Schmidt-Wolfen, and Paul Riles, who was then director of the National Museum of History and Art in Luxembourg. This committee saw the entry into the collection of works that reflected a growing acknowledgement of a decolonized and expanded worldview. Here, I just give you a few examples. Thomas Hirschhorn's World Airport, first shown at the Venice Biennial in 1999, work by Fiona Ray, Christian Marclay, Kim Suja, Cara Walker, work which we've just inaugurated as part of new displays for the collection, and this work is able to be seen again. And an early work of the 2000s by William Kentridge, Xenowriting. Ball also brought in the work of designers as part of the functioning furniture for the museum. Designers and artists. Here I'm just showing you a view taken this summer, actually, of a complete installation of an extraordinary work, which is a conceptual artwork and functional furniture for the museum by the Luxembourg artist Bert Thijs, but also working with the Erwan and Ronan Borelek for a design for what would become the Mudam Cafe, David Dubois, so bicycle racks, Andrea Blum, the gardens and fountains, which now are outside the museum, Patrick Join, his studio design. So items that were intended to support the presentation of other works, and Tobias Putri's Mudam Design Studio. Donations were also to be important during this time, as were long-term loans. And here I'm just showing a few examples. Work by Daniel Buren, which has subsequently entered the Mudam collection, but was placed on long-term loan at the opening of the museum. A donation of work by Jimmy Durham, our only work by Jimmy Durham from 2010, something which I like to think we might change. And then this wonderful work, installation by Sarah Tsay. This is post Marie-Claude Bourg during under the directorship of Enrico Longhi, Fixed Points Finding a Home from 2012, and whose acquisition was made possible through the support of Les Amis des Musées de Luxembourg. So now I'm going to enter a little bit into the now. So I arrived as director, or I was appointed at the end of 2017, and arrived to be the director of Mudam in January 2018. And of course, very quickly began to look at the collection, what had been done, what had gone before me, tried to understand what it was, its history, and also begin to articulate some points of reference for how we might think about developing it in the future. Part of that was creating a new scientific committee, advisory committee for the collection, which included Okwi and Weasel, Nancy Spector and Daniel Birnbaum. And in the very early conversations with them, it was Okwi actually who encouraged us to look back, thinking about the chronological sweep or the historic sweep of the collection, to look back to the previous decades of the 60s and 70s, and warning of the overemphasis on the year 1989 as one of cultural consensus. Somehow 1989 had become a point of reference. Okwi pointed out or reminded us that the global events of this year were the culmination of events and attitudes that had really begun to be developed towards the end of the 60s and throughout the 1970s. And so with fellow committee members, Nancy Spector and Daniel Birnbaum, he reminded us that due to our relatively recent history, Mudam had the opportunity to radically redefine the principles for a museum collection. So this is what we are beginning to do. It takes time, more time than one would imagine, and especially with COVID, more time again. And it requires a firm sense of purpose that is shared and understood by the museum stakeholders, that is to say the curatorial staff, the board, funders, and of course the public. So we're thinking now about the collection in a mutually dependent relationship to the artistic programming overall. We're not thinking in terms of quantity, we're not able to, but nor do we want to, but in terms of distinctiveness and relevance to the museum and its context, and in which our relationship with artists remains central. At the same time, we do need to acknowledge our limits, which are budgetary, spatial, and also on our capacity to actually make this collection visible. We have also been looking to make sense of the collection and what might be its defining narratives, beyond that of interdisciplinarity, to speak to a new set of narratives or subjects, themes that acknowledge coloniality, post-coloniality, and the shift from individual to collective subjectivities, both in the subjects addressed in the works that we might acquire, and also in the perception of those works by those who come into contact with them. The renewed focus on collection displays over longer periods, which serve with the idea of serving as a backbone to the museum's temporary exhibition programming, has also meant that we can consider and interrogate, or reconsider and interrogate, past choices, as well as those we might make in the future. So I was just showing you here a couple of views from, this was a display, a gallery. We have 6, among the various spaces, this backbone of the museum is really 6 galleries spread out across 3 floors of the museum, and each gallery is between 350 to 400 square meters. So they're beautiful, large spaces. So in one of these galleries, I worked with our collection team to revisit some of the acquisitions of painting that were made by the first acquisition committee to try, to see the works, many of which hadn't been seen for some years, and also to try and understand a little bit about what the motivations were. So for me, it was a kind of, I think of it as a sort of a form of psychoanalysis, digging into the museum's historical subconscious, from which one might draw out ideas, as well as to reflect upon how attitudes in acquiring as well as in art making have changed. So looking forward, so this was in 2018 already, but looking forward, among our aims for the collection today are to develop its holdings of artworks by artists from Europe and their transnational conversations in which artists from Luxembourg have a place. To offer a focused view on the work of significant artists working globally, whose work speaks to the present, that is content-driven rather than formalist in nature. To develop holdings of certain of these artists in depth, and to ensure that the collection evolves with a more balanced representation of artists in terms of gender, culture, and race that is representative of the museum's diverse publics and the world in general. Yes, finally, enabling all of this, we feel it's important to develop our capacity for research and display for the collection through collaboration with invited scholars, the creation of research fellowships, and working with guest curators who might bring new and more nuanced views onto our collection. Working with a stable, albeit modest, acquisition budget, for which we are endlessly thankful, but which has remained static since the establishment of the legal statutes for the future museum, which were established in the 1990s, we cultivate as much as possible donations, whether to accompany acquisitions or of works that we consider to be of particular significance to the collection when we can. We also wish to ensure that we are alert to opportunities of significant gifts that could prove transformative to future directions for the collection. I just cite as some very obvious examples to think of the Arensberg collection gifted to the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1950, or the successive donations from the Ludwig collection to the Ludwig Museum in Cologne. One more example, the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation bequest to the Guggenheim Museum in New York, all of which were absolutely foundational and transformative in their impact. At Mudam, we are currently in the process of establishing the museum's first collectors circle to support our ambitions for the future and for future generations. The model for this circle is taken from our fellow European museums, where individual patronage has been a vital driver throughout, certainly, the 20th century. I understand, for example, that the history of the collection of the S.M.A.K has been driven by the passion, energy, and commitment of a dedicated circle of collectors, and that some 60 years after their project began for the S.M.A.K in the late 1950s, the institution is at the stage that it is now, and I think for this reason, I think it's part of the motivation behind this series of talks. And I would like to think that through our new and nascent collectors circle, we might create the foundations for what will become a similarly admirable history for Mudam Luxembourg. Such forms of patronage contribute to the sense of civic ownership and legacy that collections can embody, not only for their patrons, but for the publics who can experience and hopefully find some meaning in them over time. So I just was going to move now to share something of what we've been in concretely, to share with you some of the acquisitions we've been making over the last few years. I mentioned, I think earlier, some sort of guiding lines, and of course, exhibition and artist-led and collecting in depth. Here, in the last few years, or 2 years, we've been able to acquire a number of important works by the artist Richard Cotter. Here I'm just showing you some examples. In 2018, we presented in partnership with the Brandhorst Museum in Munich a retrospective of Richard Cotter's work at Mudam, and from there we were able to develop the arguments really for her work to be present in the collection as a German artist who has lived between Germany from Cologne to New York over now since the 1980s, as a woman artist, a painter, and only at the first painter actually to be the focus, first woman painter to be the focus of a major retrospective in the museum since its opening. So this great work from 1999, which was part of the artist's last exhibition with Pat Hearn in New York, and this more recent work, Bond Freud National Gallery. Similarly, we've been able to acquire works by Etel Adnan. Not showing you everything, but just some examples. We partnered with the Kunstmuseum in Bern on this beautiful exhibition, which was adapted and curated by Sébastien Delou to make Etel Adnan et les Modernes, which we presented in the summer of 2019. And we have subsequently acquired a body of work by Etel. Etel being an artist who I first met in Beirut in 2005. So just to make the point too, that in terms of the conversations and the reflections that curators themselves might have, the relationships they may have with artists, sometimes from the beginning of an encounter or a meeting, or first working with an artist, or first writing about an artist, to actually seeing their work enter into a museum collection can take time, but you should never give up. It's worth it. We've also looked to give more definition to our collection strategy in relation to artists from Luxembourg, according to the same criteria as for international artists in terms of established 21st century signature works, and those artists who we think it is important to collect in depth. I'm showing here just an installation view of sculptures by the Luxembourg artist Suzanne, who's in fact based in Berlin now. And this was an exhibition that had been curated by Christophe Gallois for the museum, Mudam, and which traveled to Switzerland and then subsequently to Taipei, Shanghai. We acquired one of the works by her. There were already works by Suzanne in the collection, such as this fountain, Many Spoken Words, which is really a semi-permanent installation in the museum. This great sort of sculptural piece, which was part of her survey at the museum. Similarly, the artist Tina Gillen, who I think you may know of there in Antwerp, because she teaches at the Academy. I'm very happy to say that Tina will be representing Luxembourg in the next iteration of the Venice Biennial. But this is a recent work by Tina, but Tina actually figures among the artists whose work was acquired by the first acquisitions committee in the 1990s. So really looking to certain artists such as Tina to say, well, can we represent her practice across a period of time? Similarly, an artist who really is not very well known, if at all, outside of Luxembourg, but a really amazing and beautiful painter to whom we devoted a sort of a 20-year review or survey of his paintings this past summer, Jean-Marie Biver. A very young photographer, Jeff Weber, based in Berlin, from whom we recently acquired a major body of photographic work from this series called Personal Epistemology. Another important set of criteria for us relates to artists in particular European artists, whose practices are embedded in transnational and globalized conversations, as well as pointing to expanded approaches to medium. So we've been able to acquire a major work by Vivian Suter-Niziros that was actually commissioned for Adam Zincic's Documenta 14 and presented in Athens. She presented other works in Kassel, but this was the incredible installation that was presented in the Acropolis Park in a pavilion. It consists of 18 different canvases, just showing you the detail there. More recently, work by Silke Otto-Knapp, Moving, work that was part of her recent Renaissance Society exhibition in 2019. Painting by Eddie Hiller, who interestingly, I only realized later, whose work was really a major focus, or one of the many areas of focus in Documenta 14, here the Blue House, and a major body of work of 22 portraits by Wolfgang Tillmans, here just showing you one of those portraits of the extraordinary Oscar Niemeyer before he left us all. Of course, we believe in the importance of engaging with the work of new generations of artists that we might also follow over time. It's a much more, I don't know, I wouldn't call it being prospective, but I think it's about saying we want to stake a claim, we want to support younger artists, and we believe that these younger artists have something to say now, and that they show the potential to continue to have something to say in the future. Showing a view of the Portuguese painter Ana Manso here, Jason Scott Mussen from the US, Book, who we had presented an exhibition in 2018, recently acquired this beautiful sculptural piece by her. Just checking my notes. Suki Sukyong Kong. In fact, we have a strand that supports this area of the art of 21st century through our relationship with the Groupe Baloise, where work of art or a body of work that is recognized and identified for the Prix Baloise at the Basel Art Fair each year enters into the collection of Mudam. So it's fantastic to have a structure and a framework that ensures, in fact, builds upon this approach to the future, let's say. In order to better grasp how to approach seminal moments in the history of contemporary art, both in our programming and in our collection strategy, we've also formulated the idea of the historic contemporary, or the contemporary and its histories. A number of the artists to whom we are looking are still very much alive and making work, and which can mean we can consider acquiring work over an historic span. And I use as an example here the work of Giorgio Griffa. We were able to recently acquire a beautiful work, one of his folded canvases work from 1968, as well as one of his works from 1986, which I think of as his Matissean moment. Looking more historically, Nedko Solokov is an artist who is already in the collection of Mudam, but here, through a conversation that Nedko and I have been having since my days at Serralves, we were able to bring into the collection this really important body of drawings from 1987, Historical Decision. Patrick Seytour, who is a French artist, and who was part of the movement known as Support Surface from the 1970s, but contemporary, in fact, with the practices of an artist such as, for example, Blinky Palermo, whose work I showed you earlier on in the presentation. And then I mentioned earlier Etel Adnan, and Etel Adnan, or now in her 90s, still actively making work. And we have work from this decade, but we've also been able to acquire historic pieces by her, such as this exquisite Leporello from 1965, and this fantastic work, a tapestry, which is based on a drawing and design from 1967. So to be able to offer the opportunity to really sort of look at a span of an artist's practice, albeit in modest ways, but hopefully in representative ways, is important to us. Donations are also very important, as I mentioned earlier, and donations such as we recently received on long-term loan a donation, an important donation, which was made to our also recently formed American Friends of Mudam. And this donation of some works by some 15 artists is identified as a future gift to the museum, and could be a way for us to build upon our holdings and also potentially offer some signals for changing certain directions or building upon certain directions in the collection. So I'm just showing you a couple of examples here. So Rosa Loy, an artist actually, I'm embarrassed to say I did not know before, but a very important German painter, Markus Lupertz. Here, a piece from 1985, which sort of sits interestingly with the holdings of works from the 80s, some of which I mentioned earlier. And at Messager, also this great embroidery piece from the 1980s, and Lorna Simpson, Stereo Styles. So really, really important work for our collection and something upon which we can build, I think, or we want to be able to build more significantly. Our collection of sculptures and outdoor works for the surrounding Park Dreieschner is also a focus, and where we have the opportunity to test out possible acquisitions through exhibitions outdoors and on a temporary basis. So I'm just showing you one of the earliest. We did this show in 2019, working with Mary Bagramian and her Privileged Points, which were originally commissioned for Sculpture Project Munster of 2017. And there are 3 sculptures. We presented 2 outdoors and 1 indoors in the center of the Grand Hall. And this work was subsequently acquired and now sits outdoors. It can be indoors or outdoors, but we're wanting to really build up on our collection of works that actually have the capacity to be shown in different sites. And this is related to our desire to ensure that works are not sitting in storage somewhere, but are actually visible and can be experienced. And we're currently in the process of working on a project. I think I can announce it. It's not an acquisition as yet, but we're hoping to make real an acquisition for the collection that relates to an urbanism project for the museum. So for Luxembourg, which is in massive development in terms of this European quarter I mentioned earlier, but also in relation to the sort of transformation of the city according to what they call mobilité douce, but sort of green forms of transport, so cycling, walking, public transport. And this involves a new bridge, a foot and pedestrian bridge that would pass from the main Avenue JFK, through woodland into the museum. And it will be a kind of game changer for us in terms of accessibility for people. And this is just an artist's rendition, but a work by Monika Sosnowska, which is actually an ensemble of 3 sculptures that we're in the process of developing. But this would be a work from the Mudam collection, but that's inserted into the public sphere, more fully into the public sphere. So now I just come to, I think it was something you were all keen to hear about, so I'm sorry if I've made you wait so long, but this question of the collection in dialogue. So I think we all know that dialogues between collections, in a way, is what we do all the time when we curate exhibitions, because when we borrow works, we make loans, we're bringing works from other collections and putting them in relation to works from our collection and others at the same time. So it's about the meaning that we might generate through these juxtapositions. But here, I guess we wanted to do it really on the level of the idea of collection itself. And so these conversations or dialogues are really important sources of dynamism, I think, for thinking through what a collection might be. and how it might be presented. As I've said, it's not a new idea. In the past, works from great collections were and still are lent on long-term basis to fill gaps in historic museum collections. In our case, something we initiated in 2018 and had a first iteration in 2019 was what is at the moment, it's a continuing conversation between the Mudam collection and the Pinault Collection, which I would suggest is one of the great contemporary art collections in Europe at this moment. And that this dialogue developed out of a shared commitment to contemporary art and also out of relationships of collegiality, in this case with the Pinault Collection's curator, Caroline Bourgeois, and myself. These relationships of collegiality are an important part of the ecosystem of museums and cultural producers in general. And today, more than ever, being able to work with institutions and colleagues who share a desire to be open, to share skills, to share ideas, to share their collections in a spirit of collaboration is an unquantifiable enabling force for museums in their fast-changing ecology. Thanks to our relationship with the Pinault Collection, we've been able to offer an expanded lens through which to appreciate works in our own collection, both for ourselves and, of course, for our many publics. Here I'm just showing one view, two works, one in the foreground, one in the midground by Jan Vaux, that we were able to present in 2019. There are a number of sculptures. We own one single work by Jan Vaux, so then we were able to do this wonderful display of his work. So as well as offering the opportunity to provide a broader or deeper contextualization of the work of an artist, such conversations or dialogues are also intended to introduce for us and our publics a spirit of aspiration, a sense of what is possible. And this is through the example of other collections we consider to be exemplary in themselves. Here, we're just next week, we'll be installing, ready for a week from now, a new presentation of a sculpture from the Mudam collection, work by Pedro Cabrito Reis, which is a large scaffolding light installation with a beautiful work in the collection of the Pinault Collection by Gareth Wynne Evans. So this is one response to the many questions around sustainability, of course, for museum collections, from the inability to match the increasingly unattainable market price of works by artists, to the research and making visible and accessible different collections, their storage, their conservation. So working in concert with other institutions and their collections regionally and more broadly is also a model. I just wanted to show you here as well, when I talk about sustainability, I mean, the history of great collections is also someone, a dear former colleague of mine, or present colleague, but someone with whom I once worked, said to me was, well, the history of great collections is also the history of things that were never acquired. So I'm just showing you here a partial view of amazing work by Henri Sala that we showed between 2019-20, The Last Resort, in our pavilion gallery, which is absolutely stunning. And it's a work that I think everyone desired and felt should be at home in the Mudam collection. But at the moment, it remains a work that is out of reach for us. So where do we go from here? We're especially thinking at the moment about who are the artists whose works speak in aesthetic and conceptually profound ways to our moments of social, ecological, technological, and economic change. I'll show you an example of this great recent acquisition by Eric Baudelaire, which is an ensemble. It's a continuing, ongoing project where he has been writing to every member of the House of Lords in Britain to ask them about Brexit. So precisely, where are we going? So it's an absolutely fantastic piece, and so of the moment, and I think in the future will also resonate in very powerful ways about this moment. Sandra Perry, I mentioned that I'm showing this work because it was actually acquired as part of a relationship that we have with a corporate sponsor, actually, and it was an ongoing relationship, a mediated relationship where Mudam received a gift every 2 years of a work that was, let's call it a video work of moving image. And we looked to sort of reframe that and give it a greater definition, and say, well, why? Why would we want to receive new works? What are the filters that we want to use here? And so, for example, in the case of this great work by Sandra Perry, which is actually a piece that formed part of the, not this previous Berlin Biennial, but the one before, we sort of looked to suggest that we might frame the donation relationship around those emerging artists who are really working with moving image and technology in innovative new ways, and who have something to say through this evolving technology. Our proposal also included, along with that, the creation of a 2-year sponsored curatorial research position that would be dedicated precisely to this new generation of artists, and the way that they're working with new technologies as a form of image making and narrative storytelling as a defining aspect. So, attempting to think beyond the current pandemic, there is an even greater sense of urgency for museums in their capacity to ensure their collections continue to be relevant and alive to us. This does not, and I think cannot, mean endless accumulation, but instead being able to activate collections in ways that can always be relevant or continue to be relevant to the changing perceptions and attitudes of successive times of the contemporary. In order to do so, choices need to be made and perhaps strategies rethought, along with new modes of display and public engagement. Among the many risks being faced by museums due to financial pressures to maintain certain exhibition models based on visitor attendance and the perception of a negative ecological impact from bringing artists and artworks from other places, or the types of art and by which artists that we might show and collect. So among all of those risks, and many more, is that we no longer give ourselves permission to go beyond what we know and to test out and propose new models for the museum and its publics and new ways of working together. For this, I believe it is through our privileged relationships with artists that we can continue to be fearless in our work. Through their work, artists make visible and enable recognition of the textured complexity of the world, in which the ability to acknowledge uncertainty in the face of pronounced certainties is a strength. I've been reading the recently published essays by the American art historian and curator Darby English in his To Describe a Life, and I'm struck by his writing about how, and I quote, great artists can lessen the force of one's own thought and vision. For, he writes, one has to rethink in order to apprehend. As long as museums can continue to allow themselves to learn from artists and their art, to rethink, to reapprehend, museums, regardless of the size of their cities, can continue to allow the possibility for others to learn from them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And first, before we go further with some questions, we first of all want to give our apologies to you and to everyone. Suzanne, you didn't know probably, but sorry to everyone who's watching for the bad sound quality at the beginning of the lecture. Apparently my introduction was not so good comprehensible because of some echo sounds, so I will shortly sketch the context of this lecture series again. So the context is the exhibition Museum for a Small City, rebuilt by Richard Venlet. The exhibition presents a platform for a critical engagement with S.M.A.K's permanent collection, during which the artist curates different presentations of works from the collection and the archive of S.M.A.K. The aims of this lecture series is to connect Richard Venlet's contextual exercise with ideas relating to the contemporary institutional efforts to revalue their history, as well as with the expanding body of thought that offers insight in how collections can respond to political, social, and cultural issues. Our first two guests in this series are Suzanne Cotter and Clémentine Delis. And of course, we just heard Suzanne, director of Mudam, Luxembourg, and board member of S.M.A.K, the International Committee of Modern and Contemporary Art Museums and Collections, and her engagement with the Mudam collection. So luckily, Suzanne, during your lecture, the sound was much better, and I see that some questions are coming in. So if you're ready for it, I'll shoot them.
They're in Dutch, so I can't read them. You'll have to translate for them, I think.
Yes, of course. First question from Lawrence is, are commissions important in your acquisition policies?
No and yes. I say in that order. I think commissions are a difficult thing because you can, you need to know what you're commissioning for, and you can find yourself in commissioning perhaps with a work that in the end doesn't really correspond with what might have been anticipated or what really makes sense. I mean, in my experience, commissioned works can very easily evolve in different ways. So commissions in the sense of inviting an artist to create a work for the collection specifically, no. Then it's not that they're not important, but they're not a focus at all because there are too many questions around them, which is not to say that an artist might be commissioned for a particular context, and as a result of that commission, that work ends up becoming part of the collection. So it's a different dynamic. And the other thing is that Mudam has a history. I mean, it's not a massive history, but there is a history, and I'd like to think we might continue to have it, of being involved in co-commissions that can involve films, that may involve different projects, but that would be working with other institutions and really contributing to enabling something. In my experience, more associated, for example, with performance. So we recently co-commissioned with the Art Institute of Chicago a new choreographic work by Alexandra Bexetzis, for example. And so the nature of that work, of working in dance and performance and choreography, depends or relies on a commissioning process. Otherwise, the work can't really exist, but it's a different form.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Marius Delbecq. He writes, the museum works with the hashtag Open Museum and the hashtag This is your collection on the website, alluding to the idea that the entire nation is in fact a collector and concerned by the collection. What's your vision on this?
Well, the hashtag Open Museum really is meant to be the museum overall. I think that the museum, so it goes beyond the collection, but of course the collection is one of the pillars of the museum, of what it is. I think speaking with our team and my colleagues who actually are responsible for our public mediation program and education programs and working with schools, and one of their ambitions is to see the collection figuring within the national curriculum for art in schools. So it's a sort of generating a sense of ownership. So in that sense, the Open Museum hashtag refers to that ambition, but it especially refers to the ambition that everyone will feel that the museum is their museum, and it's not just for a particular public or a particular sector or section or demographic of the population.
And another question, maybe in addition of this one, is how do you look at the use of digital instruments being a mode of communication in COVID times now? How do you look at this in relation to the museum's future?
Well, it's the question on everybody's lips. It's a great question. I think we're all grappling with it. I mean, it's there because we live in a digital era at the moment. And like many museums, the collection has been accessible or sort of identifiable, let's say the inventory, via the digital platform of the website for since I think the museum opened. And since COVID, of course, like many museums, everyone was suddenly had a huge wake-up call. It's not as if we hadn't been talking about it, but how do we stay in contact with people? How can we continue to produce content? So it was very important, but we also discovered, I mean, there are a number of things, like we just did a really simple survey of how many people were responding to our digital content during the lockdown, and we found that there was less engagement with the digital platform. There was a lot, but it was like half of what there is when the museum is actually open, which suggests to us that it's the combination of, it's not just about finding out about information or even being able to follow programs online. It's being able to relate them to what something that they've seen at the museum or something that might propel them to go and visit the museum. So at the moment where we are, we can't even talk about our digital strategy. It's sort of like, what does that mean? We're thinking about it, but what we recognize is the importance of a coexistence of accessibility via technological means and others. But I think this technology, there's a different direction, a different way to think about it too. So there's about going out, and people can be at home or be in different countries in the world and know about us and follow our programs. But we're also thinking about it in relation to accessibility in general. So for people who come to the museum, what are the barriers to them having an experience with works of art or with different exhibitions that are on view according to their physical needs or disabilities? So we really want to think about technology a little bit more in that way, I think, as well. I mean, we recently, the person who posed that question may know perhaps that we launched in October a completely undone thing by us before, but a project, a curatorial project created entirely for online. And this was our response to having to cancel a physical exhibition, our major exhibition for the summer, that was due to open. And after months of scenario thinking, we said we would cancel it, and we explored, could we not try to reproduce the exhibition online, but could we take some of the curatorial ideas and see them translated in some kind of digital form? And so for this, we worked with Base Design and their office in Brussels to do it. And the curators was guest curator Francesco Bonami and Emanuela Mazzonis, and our curatorial team, our communication and digital team. And we were really excited with what we came up with. But we said from the outset, we don't know what this is going to be. So I think, I was saying at the end of my lecture, you have to give yourself permission. We care about doing things that are meaningful. We don't just want to use websites and create digital content for the sake of it. We really want to sort of do something that might add to the landscape and indeed the cacophony of everything else. And sometimes we might fail. But maybe if we do a little bit less, we might fail less too, which is not to say we're not going to keep on trying things. But we need to embrace it, and we need to address it. What choices we might make going forward, that's to be seen. But I also believe very much in the younger generation of curators and of thinkers and people for whom the medium of the digital, or the media of the digital media, is something that is a material that they sort of understand. They have a different kind of intelligence for it. And I think that's exciting and interesting, because that will take us to places where certainly me, born in the analog age, can't, I'd like to think I could imagine it, but I can't.
Thank you. You talked to us about the collection in dialogue with other institutions and collections and with the Pinault Collection. And there's a specific question about this. It's if this collaboration with this private collection responds to a certain need, and what do you learn from this collaboration?
I'm sorry, does it respond to a certain what?
A certain need.
I think of it as a way of thinking. I think, it's like doing shows when you do displays of the collection. I think it's a way of thinking, it's the end result of research, but there's also a propositional dimension to it because you never quite know what is going to happen until you get works of art in a situation together. So I think this saying, well, here's a fantastic collection. They have works. There's a convergence of interest, certainly on my part, in relation to the artists who are represented in the Pinault Collection, and having seen a number of their exhibitions and being able to sort of read a little bit more about it and speaking with Caroline, it just seems an opportunity to say, look, let's do something that's quite nimble actually to do. But it's interesting, and it's about giving other people access to great works of art. They don't have to go to the, Punta della Dogana or have the ability to go there. They can actually go here in Luxembourg and see, there's this great piece of work or a great body of work. So, there are a number of reasons. So is that a need? I think it's a proposition that we hope is an opportunity, really.
Okay, thank you. I wish you good luck with the next dialogue next week in the opening of the new show.
It'll be beautiful. There won't be anyone at the opening because we're not doing openings, but the work is going to be very beautiful.
I see a next question coming in. Is Mudam collecting works that disappear over time?
Yes. There's an amazing sculpture actually that disappeared since I arrived, and that was a work that was commissioned for the Great Hall by a Russian sculptor, Politsky, and that according to the artist's wishes, it was acquired. And then it was installed in actually in the place where I showed you the view of the sculpture by Nari Bagramian, Privileged Points, outdoors. It was there, and according to the conditions of the work, it was allowed to, no conservation work was to be carried out. It was just made of wood, no preservation treatment in any way, and that it was to be allowed to fall apart, and after 10 years it would be removed, and that's exactly what happened.
This was a question from Adam Leach. He's our artist in residence at the moment at S.M.A.K, and he sends a second part. He has a second question.
Okay.
It seems you need to balance the vision of your museum with receiving gifts and donations. Are you ever in a situation where you reject a gift because it does not fit with your vision?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, it's not a gift, it's a proposal for a gift. So like all museums, we have a policy with respect to donations. We don't, if someone walks up and says, here I have a painting, or here I have an object, or here I have a work that will no longer exist in 10 years, it goes through exactly the same process of any of our acquisitions, where we really consider it in terms of its relevance, obviously the nature of the work, the quality of the work, the conservation issues. Is it emblematic? What does it add? If it does add something to the collection, what are the opportunities it represents? And of course, if it doesn't fit those criteria, we can, politely decline to accept a work. That's really standard practice for a museum, because you could have lots and lots of things, but it's not necessarily, you have criteria for the collection.
In addition to this question, also from Adam Leach, you talked about framing donations. What are the important lines and how do you set up such a dialogue?
There's different ways. I mean, donations can come in different ways. A way that is common, I think, and one that we are looking to develop is donations that accompany acquisitions. So it can be, it could be, major work. It could be an accompanying work, like, a set of drawings that relate to a sculpture, or it can take different forms. So that's something that we encourage. And I think, like most museum directors, I've become very brazen in asking about that, because I think there is no harm in asking. A lot too depends on the relationships that you've had, because if donations, depending if they're coming from galleries who are representing artists, well, then there's also has to be a shared will, and that relates to goodwill. So I think the question of goodwill is very important in relation to donations. That if you've worked, you've shown real commitment to an artist and their work, both through an exhibition, but also through an acquisition or significant acquisition, that is a motivation. It's not necessarily the decider, but these things are important. So it's, donations are really about relationships. And similarly with collectors, they're about relationships of trust, I think. For me, I think it's also part of wanting to cultivate that trust is showing how serious the museum is, but also reminding people that, a work being in a museum collection, it's forever. It's like it becomes inalienable in principle, when you're thinking about creating a heritage that is for future generations. And that's a very different thing to a work that might sit in a private collection. I love private collections and private collectors, but it's more about, what can incite a donation, I think, is really distinguishing the role of the museum in relation to other types of collecting.
Okay, thank you. Suzanne, unless you would like to add something, then...
No, I think I've spoken enough, probably.
Then I want to thank you very much for sharing your insights with us and this interesting evening. And to the audience, again, apologize for the bad sound in the beginning. And don't forget to tune in next Thursday evening, 8 p.m. We have a next lecture with Clémentine Delis. And I also want to mention that S.M.A.K will reopen its doors on Saturday. So if you want to see the Museum for a Small City rebuilt yourself, you're all welcome. And we also are proud to show you then two new exhibitions, a solo exhibition of Anna Bogigian and a group show Growing in Lockdown. Thank you very much and have all a nice evening.
Thank you, Alicia. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.